Welcome back to my channel. This will be the last video in the series on alleged themes in the Gospel of John. So if you're getting tired of this series or this series wasn't really your thing, come back next time. We'll be doing something else. I'm going to combine two alleged themes or little passages that are taken to indicate a editor, someone else very heavily involved in the writing of the Gospel of John, and that's partly to wrap up the series today. This will give me the opportunity as well to read my favorite quotation from Richard Bauckham, so stay with me, and we'll get a long quotation from Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, a little bit later in this video. So I want to start with the first one I'm going to talk about today. And this is the transition from the end of John 20 to the beginning of the incident in John 21, which is another resurrection appearance. All right, so he's just described the appearance to all of the disciples in Jerusalem where doubting Thomas is present, and Jesus offers Thomas the chance to touch his wounds and so forth. All right. John 20, 30, and 31. Many other signs, therefore, Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Now that has this ring to it, right? Almost as if it's the ending. And then the next verse says, which is John 21:1, after these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way. And it goes into describing Simon Peter's decision to go fishing. And then after fishing all night, they see Jesus on the shore, they have breakfast with him, and so forth. So the alleged theme here is just the fact that it sounds like it's ending at chapter 20, 30 and 31. It has this kind of wind up, this is the purpose. And then suddenly we get another incident. And there's even a certain amount of redundancy. I'll be talking a lot more about this very end of chapter 21. But the very last verse, 25, there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books which were written. Okay, so kind of that allusion to not telling everything that Jesus did and so forth is similar in the two places. So the idea is, wow, this is weird. Looks like the gospel has two endings. A little bit redundant. Isn't that awkward? Or isn't it awkward that we move from sounding like it's ending at 2031 to, revving back up again and giving another story in 21. Now, I'm completely open to the idea that John, the beloved disciple, may have dictated, if he's dictating, or written, if he's writing it, literally holding the pen, whichever, the end of chapter 20 with this, rousing wind-up, and then may have thought of an appendix. I really want to tell that story about the Sea of Galilee. And just going into that and not really thinking twice about it. I don't imagine that the entire gospel was written on the same day, or much less dictated on the same day. So he could easily have come back on another day and kind of picked up. That incident is in chronological order with what's in chapter 20, so it makes perfect sense for it to be a continuation of the gospel. There is no textual evidence that the entirety of John 21 is not part of the gospel at all. Okay, that's entirely conjectural. So in that respect, it's unlike the story of the woman caught in adultery, which Augustine acknowledged was not found in some of those earliest manuscripts. So, and the style of chapter 21 is the same. It's that same not very high Greek style that's very distinctive. of the author. So, there's really no reason to think that it's by a different person. Okay, so why does this indicate the activity of an editor? Well, Gary Burge, whom I've been using in this study, all he says is most scholars think that 2031 was the original ending. Now, that's just a sheer bandwagon argument. The question is why they think it. Okay, then he acknowledges that chapter 21 is in the same style, that it even continues counting Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. So the one by the Sea of Galilee is the third appearance to his disciples. And then he says, but a careful editor, and he even uses that term, careful, could have shaped chapter 21 in the same style as and format as chapters 1 through 20. Now think about this again for a minute. This is supposedly a careful editor. This is someone who's supposedly trying to make things go well, go smoothly. If he's that careful of an editor, why would he have left the very slight awkwardness of the apparent ending at 30 and 31, 20, 30, and 31, that little bit there? He could easily have moved it to the very end of the whole book. I mean, he's an editor. That's what he's supposedly doing. So why are we imagining someone who is a quote-unquote careful editor but is not acting like a careful editor? So this awkwardness, this slight quote-unquote seam here at the end of chapter 20 is not an indication of another person. It's just an indication at most of the beloved disciple telling another story that came after, and chronologically also came after the story that he tells in chapter 20. By the way, when I just going to put this in here because people sometimes get ridiculous ideas. When I say verses this or chapter that, I'm just using that so you know what I'm talking about. I am not saying that the chapters and the verse numbers were in the original manuscript. I'm not saying that, but you never know what someone's going to take from my words, so I just thought I'd throw that in there. All right, so this one's pretty easily disposed of. Since 21 definitely appears to come from the same person, and fits really well, with the narrative and everything, the narrative order, even counting the appearances of Jesus, why should we think that this is an indication of the heavy involvement of some other, essentially co-author, editor involved here? In fact, an editor would more be expected to shift those verses to the very end. All right, but now I'm going to move on to a different one, and this is the one I'll spend the rest of the time on here. I'm going to read John 21, verses 24 and 25. All right, so it's just wrapped up the thing about some of the people thought that maybe the beloved disciple wouldn't die, and then it draws attention to exactly what Jesus said. He didn't say that he wouldn't die, but he said, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? Jesus said that to Peter. By the way, someone drew my attention to this, and I wish I could remember who it was so I could hat tip him every time I say this. That drawing attention to what Jesus literally said is really strong evidence against the idea that, ancient people wouldn't mind, the original audience wouldn't mind John putting his own words, his own interpretations into the mouth of Jesus. I thought that was a great point when a correspondent pointed that out to me, whoever he was. Here it's like really emphasizing, no, Jesus didn't say this, he said this, implying that it's really giving you a very clear, semantically accurate account of what Jesus said on this occasion so that it can actually use that to argue against the idea that the beloved disciple would never die. I think that's really, really cool. But, okay, so we've just finished that. And then 21:24. This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books which were written. Now, I'm going to put my cards on the table, as to what I think about just those last two verses, 24 and 25. To me, they read like a coda. That's a word we use in music. It's just this little bit on the end that you only play at the end. Or I'm going to use the analogy of a post-it note. So you've got like this whole manuscript, right? And it's, you've taken it to FedEx, and you've had it printed, you've had covers put on, and then you put a post-it note on the front. So this post-it note, that's just those two verses, seems to be plausible that it was written by another person. That is not saying, and that's my big emphasis here, that this other person was an editor and that he was involved in editing the whole gospel, even wrote chapter 21. The whole point, to me, there is that different nature of just those two verses, that it looks like a post-it note commenting on who wrote this. Richard Bauckham takes the even stronger position that these two verses were actually written by the beloved disciple, or dictated, and we'll be talking about dictation in a moment here. And he's just continuing to refer to himself in the third person. I don't think the difference between me and Bauckham is very great on this point, because, I'm just talking about those two verses, and I'm saying it absolutely does not reflect negatively on the authorship of all the rest of it right up until then. In fact, the very meaning of those two verses is, by the way, everything right up into here was written by that beloved disciple that we're talking about. Okay? Prima facie, it is asserting that the beloved disciple wrote the gospel, including the incident by the Sea of Galilee. It's what it says. He's the disciple who wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. So to take it to indicate that the beloved disciple didn't write them is really weird. Post-it note analogy. You have a manuscript, some kind of book. It's looks like it's telling about historical incidents. All right, there it is. And you have a post-it note on the front. And it says, this book was written by John Jones, and we know that what he says is true. All right? So you take it that the post-it note was written by somebody else, but only the post-it note. In fact, the whole point of the post-it note is to tell you that everything that's between the covers was written by John Jones, right? That's what it says. You don't take that and go, oh, was maybe this indicates that the person who wrote the post-it note was actually a co-author of the whole thing that's right there, all the rest of it that's there in the actual manuscript. Like, why would you think that? Why would you think that? Or, maybe there was this whole community, and John Jones just sort of stands behind it in some way, and the community actually wrote what's in between. The post-it note says John Jones wrote the book, okay? And yet, Burge, when he's talking about this, he says, is this first-hand evidence of John's disciples who assisted him in editing the gospel? Why would you even think that? All right, first-hand evidence of John's disciples' existence. We assume that John, he had a pastoral role, he was an apostle, there were people who listened to him. Fine, actually, we kind of knew such people probably existed, but assisted him in editing the gospel, it doesn't say anything about that. In fact, it says he wrote it. Okay, so it's this strange backwards thing. I've even seen scholars, and I wasn't able to find one quickly to cite specifically, so you just have to take my word for it that I've seen it. But I've seen scholars talking about this idea that at the most, the beloved disciples stood behind it, and that other people were involved, like in the whole gospel, okay? Editing it heavily or writing it or whatever. And in parentheses, they'll cite John 21, 24, and 25 as a reference without elaborating, but, it's being cited there as if it supports the statement that's just been made, that John didn't actually write the Gospel of John, that at the most he stood behind it. So it's being treated, and if you're just reading that and you're not familiar, you could think, oh, I guess there's some place at the end in the Gospel of John where it says he didn't write it, or where it says somebody else edited it, or somebody else was, heavily involved in co-authoring it. It's got this reference here. I assume that reference says that. And then you look it up and the reference says exactly the opposite, of course. And that's a really bad habit that scholars have. That if, one scholar cites something as saying this, then other scholars come along and they just cite those same verses as if they're saying that, and they kind of copy each other without really stopping to think, does that verse really indicate that? All right, this leads me to my favorite Bauckham quote. This concerns the word graphein, which is to write, of course, and the disciple who wrote these things, he wrote, okay? And Bauckham is just very impatient with the idea that this could mean just that he stood somewhere behind the gospel. And he's very impatient with the attempt to use the possible existence of a secretary or an amanuensis to support this much looser connection, because it doesn't support any loose connection like that. Okay, and you know what? I forgot to write down my page numbers, so I'll try to remember to put the page numbers from Bauckham's second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses into the show notes. But it's going to be a nice long quote. All right. The disciple in question is the disciple who appears as an anonymous figure at key points in the Gospel's narrative, usually described as the disciple Jesus loved. Pause for a moment. As you might know, Richard Bauckham thinks this is a different disciple of Jesus named John. I disagree with him on that other John theory, but I agree with him that the beloved disciple wrote the Gospel. Okay, so this passage is something that I'm in complete agreement with. Okay. This was the traditional understanding of the words until the modern period. But most modern scholars have been reluctant to accept this claim. One rather popular way of evading it has been the suggestion that verse 24 does not really claim that the beloved disciple was the author of the gospel. The language used need not, in other words, on this view, mean actual authorship, but may point to a rather less direct relationship between the beloved disciple and the gospel. This argument depends on the notion that the Greek word graphein, write, may be used in a causative sense, meaning to cause to write. Then the disciple is said not to have written these things, but to have caused them to be written. Okay, so I'm going to snip out a bit and then continue reading. What this evidence proves is that graphein can refer to authorship by dictation to a scribe. So, like Paul had scribes and still said that he wrote, and so forth. Many ancient authors did not themselves wield the pen when they composed their writings, for writing was a craft better left to those who had been trained to do it well. However, we should be clear that in this slightly extended sense of graphein, the author dictates the words. Snip. A scribe taking dictation of works, such as Paul's letters, might exercise discretion in minor grammatical or stylistic matters, just as a modern secretary taking dictation or a publisher's copy editor preparing an author's text for publication might do. We know that the Jewish historian Josephus, for example, employed secretaries to improve his Greek style. Pause for a moment. I want to mention that if there was a secretary involved here, he doesn't seem to have improved John's Greek style. John's Greek style is still, it's kind of elementary. That's kind of what makes it distinctive. So it's really strange that you get people pushing on this secretary idea. As I've mentioned in other videos, Michael Licona has even suggested that John might have had a secretary who suggested to him that he change certain factual matters. Like, hey, how about if we move the temple cleansing to the beginning of Jesus' ministry, even though it didn't happen then? That's a very heavy involvement of a secretary who then doesn't seem to have done what secretaries usually did, which was to improve style. It's very backwards. All right, continuing with Bauckham. But in such cases, the author reads, approves, and takes responsibility for the final text. It is not that the author has merely caused the word to be written, but that he or she has been assisted in writing his or her own work. This kind of assistance does not require a special causative sense of to write. Many scholars, from Bernard himself onward, have taken the evidence that Graphein could refer to writing by dictation as a warrant for interpreting John 21:24 as attributing the beloved disciple to the beloved disciple a relationship to the gospel considerably less direct than Pilate's to the inscription on the cross or Paul's to his letters. Bernard's own position is moderate. Now he's quoting the scholar Bernard. The beloved disciple caused these things to be written. They were put into shape by the writer, who took them down and afterwards published them, not as his own, but as the gospel according to John. Okay, now Bauckham continues. It is not very clear what this putting into shape is supposed to have involved, but other scholars have stretched it a long way. Writing in the hugely influential Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Gottlob Schrenk first cited the Pauline evidence that Graphein can refer to dictation and then continued. And this is Bauckham quoting Schrenk. In the light of this incontrovertible fact, that it may be asked whether the who has written these things of John 21:24 might not simply mean that the beloved disciple and his recollections stand behind this gospel and are the occasion of its writing. This is a very possible view, so long as we do not weaken unduly the second aspect. Indeed, it would be difficult to press the formula to imply other than an assertion of spiritual responsibility for what is contained in the book. Okay, end of Schrenk quote, continuation of Bauckham quote. The progression of thought in these three sentences is breathtaking, says Bauckham. Can you tell why I love this quote? This is Bauckham's bad tone. Somehow, Schrenk finds it possible to move from the incontrovertible fact that Graphein can refer to dictation to claiming it would be difficult to press the formula to mean more that the beloved disciple had spiritual responsibility for what is contained in the book. Not a single example is given of the use of Graphein to assert no more than spiritual responsibility for the content of a book. No evidence at all is added to the Pauline evidence that Graphein can refer to authorship by dictation. What is even more remarkable is the way in which this staggeringly faulty piece of argument has been uncritically followed by scholar after scholar. It must be stressed that no one has yet produced any evidence that Graphein can be used to refer to a relationship between author and text more remote than that of the dictation of a text to a scribe. No one seems even to have looked for such evidence. Yet the notion that John 21:24 asserts no more than that the beloved disciple's witness lies somewhere at the source of the tradition that later, in other very creative hands, produced the gospel has become common. Scholar after scholar has evidently found it sufficient that previous Johannine scholars have found this view credible despite the lack of linguistic evidence. This must be because they have found it so hugely improbable that the beloved disciple could himself be the author of the gospel that they have grasped, like a dying man, at the straw of possibility that 21:24 does not say that he was. But whatever reasons a scholar might have to doubt that the beloved disciple wrote the gospel, these cannot serve, in the absence of linguistic evidence, to determine the meaning of the words has written them in John 21:24. Okay, end of Bauckham quote. I mean, I just couldn't have said it better myself, like standing up going, bravo, bravo. Staggeringly faulty and so forth. So, Bauckham goes on to say that if you're going to claim that the beloved disciple was not the author in a very strong sense here, you're going to have to say that it's pseudonymous. In other words, that it's trying to give the impression that the beloved disciple was, but it's hiding the fact that it wasn't. Now, Bauckham doesn't adopt that either, but his point is that the gospel itself very strongly presents itself as written, in a very strong sense of written, by the beloved disciple. So I think we can see here that this idea that it shows the existence of editors involved with this, it just definitely doesn't say that. And, even that stylistic notion doesn't appear to be the case, because the style is not a high Greek style. It's not even as high as the style of Luke. So 21, 24, and 25 don't indicate that the book itself was, edited by some editor who came along subsequent to the beloved disciple and, did all this stuff. Certainly not the multiple editors that Raymond Brown talks about. I hope you've seen in this series that too often scholars are, as you might say, taking in each other's laundry. They're accepting what others have accepted rather than looking at it in a fresh way with fresh eyes. Now, next time I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about, probably I'll start among my ideas with what I'm going to call 3 meanings of meaning. So that's going to have to do with the idea that it was somehow okay for the gospel authors to change the facts or to invent things that were said that weren't really recognizably said, as long as they had the same meaning. And I'm going to talk about the ambiguity on the concept of meaning there and the way that's being used in a slippery way. That's teaching us to look at the Gospels independently in a way that we can think through and try to get clear about these things rather than just saying, well, scholars think or scholars say. And that's what we're doing here at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.